The inaugural webinar of the new webinar series by the VCDNP with a focus on deterrence and emerging technologies. The impact of technologies such as cyber, artificial intelligence, autonomous weapons, modern conventional weapons, situational awareness tools, on the strategic stability, deterrence, and overall risk on nuclear weapons use is one of the topics that gains more and more salience in the international debate. During the Cold War, key security relationship, first and foremost between the United States and the Soviet Union, as well as West and East in general, were based on mutual deterrence, including but not limited to nuclear. One of the measures of international security was the stability of deterrence, which helped the political and military leaderships better plan foreign and defense policy, avoid undesired conflict, and control the arms race, while maintaining the ability to adequately respond to the attack of the opponent. The record was not perfect, but nonetheless, helped avoid large-scale war for several decades. A host of these new technologies that recently emerged, and some are still kind of reaching their maturity, are already affecting the stability of traditional deterrence relationship between West and Russia, and also now between the West and China. So the VCDNP Deterrence and Emerging Technologies webinar series will explore the impact of these new technologies on the stability of deterrence. And also we'll look at the opportunities that some of this new technology can offer for arms control and confidence building measures. To kick us off in the discussion of these issues, we invited Dr. Andrew Futter, and he will attempt to framework the discussion of this overarching big issues and pave way to our more in-depth dive into some of these technologies in the follow-up series of webinars. For those of you who joined us today, we're inviting you to join us every next Wednesday for another 5 webinars, same time. And you could find more information about the webinar series and each webinar on our website, vcdnp.org. But now I really am excited and looking forward to give the floor to our speaker today. Dr. Andrew Futter is Professor of International Politics at the University of Leicester, UK. He authored several books, including Ballistic Missile Defense and US National Security Policy, The Top Politics of Nuclear Weapons, Reassessing the Revolution in Military Affairs, The United Kingdom and the Future of Nuclear Weapons, Hacking the Bomb, and Threats to Euro-Atlantic Security, which came out recently in 2020. He regularly publishes in academic journals, contributes to conference paper, and he is currently working on a 5-year project exploring the technical drivers of the third nuclear age. And wait a moment, Andrew will explain what he means by that. I'm also extremely excited and grateful to welcome him because we had a pleasure to work together at some point when he was a visiting fellow or visiting scholar at the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies in Monterey. And I follow his work with great interest and always impressed and overwhelmed by the wealth of knowledge, particularly on some of these complex issues that are relatively new to many of us, but they are, as I mentioned, make more and more salient, significant impact on the international debate and discussions. Andrew, please start off us with the deterrence in the 21st century and the impact of new technologies.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Elena. I'll just try and make sure I can load up the PowerPoints. There's always a bit where you wonder if something's going to go wrong. Can you see that?
Yes, we can see. Yeah, looks good.
Yeah, I hope everyone can see it. Well, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. It's very, very kind, and it's a real pleasure, privilege, and honor to be engaging with the VCDNP people. Group, and I know some of the fantastic work you've done in the past and on these types of topics, and it's really great to come along and be able to share some ideas there. And I think that is what this talk and our role is. It's about trying to share ideas. I don't think any of us have all of the answers to some of the questions that are being posed by emerging new disruptive technologies and what is probably a change in the nuclear order more broadly. But what we can do, I think, is begin a discussion and hopefully raise some questions and begin thinking about how we secure ourselves in the next 70 years, if indeed that's what it is that we live with the bomb. Elena was very kind to mention some of my previous work, and I guess really I've been interested in this interaction between technology and nuclear order, and I suppose by implication deterrence, for the best part of 15 years, going back to my PhD, which looked at US ballistic missile defense. I've since done some work on strategic non-nuclear weapons, the interaction of so-called cyber capabilities with nuclear weapons, and just trying to think about this intersection of changes in technology, of weapon systems, of a broader digitized information context, and how this changes our relationship with nuclear weapons, and perhaps most importantly, how we make sure nuclear weapons aren't used again. So absolutely delighted to be able to kick off this series of seminars, and I think, as Elena said, the colleagues that will follow me will go into much more detail into the technologies. What I thought I would try and do today is give a bit of an overview and an introduction, and again, just share some thoughts and ideas. And this isn't me saying that I know all the answers. It really is about trying, I think, at this stage to really understand the problem, and it's only by understanding that problem that we can start to move forward. I understand that Noah, who very kindly got up early this morning to do a test call to check that the PowerPoint worked, will be tweeting and will, I think, send around a copy of the PowerPoint. But if you do want to get in contact with me, or there is any reason that you can't ask questions or engage on this platform, then my email address and Twitter address or handle are at the bottom of this page, and please feel free to get in contact with me. So I think we are in a position where we're on the cusp of, or have begun entering into a much more dangerous nuclear age. Now, this is not to say that previous nuclear eras haven't been dangerous, that we've not been very worried or got very close to the edge before, but I think we're moving into a very different period where we just may not necessarily have the toolkit or the understanding, or even in some respects, the desire to really understand what is happening. And in fact, we may even be sleepwalking into this. The fact that global nuclear order society, the way we interact, not just with weapons, but with each other, is changed in a way perhaps unimaginable than where it was maybe even 20 or 30 years ago. And this is having a considerable impact on the global nuclear order. So Elena mentioned in the introductory remarks that I'm currently working on, or leading a team working on, a project looking at the idea of a third nuclear age. So I'll talk a bit more about this as we go through. But the idea here is that we are on the cusp of, or entering into, a very new, different era, and that one of the main drivers of this is a range of different technologies, technological pressures, and a technological context, which are basically changing the way we think about our nuclear world. Many of these, or rather, unlike what has happened in the past, many of these technologies, whether they be weapon systems or more dual use, or even kind of more contextual developments, are happening at the same time. And that really is something that didn't happen before. And these, when taken together and viewed in the round or holistically, are creating a variety of different challenges. And of course, as we're going to focus on today, there are very acute or interesting challenges for deterrence and ideas of deterrence that have been around probably since the 1960s. How we manage and think about escalation, proliferation challenges, stability challenges, crisis challenges, and of course, arms control challenges as well. So I think it's important to note that while we're focused today on deterrence, this really is only one part of a much broader challenge to nuclear order and all of the different facets and orthodoxy which undergird this. I think part of the problem we've had in addressing this emerging technology challenge is some of the terminology, and the phrases new, emerging, disruptive are all often used differently, sometimes to mean the same thing or in combination with each other. And I think this can be a little bit confusing because in some respects, the technologies that we are worried about now are not necessarily emerging. They may have emerged, or they may have changed, they may have become more important. So it's a slightly unusual, a slightly different way of thinking about this. So it's not always about emerging or new, but actually about things that are already there, but just maybe changing in importance. And the way I tend to conceptualize this, to get round the way that it's been clouded and also to try and avoid some of the hype that surrounds this, is that emerging and disruptive technologies comprise weapons, but also the support and subsystems. And I think increasingly also the context within which these are deployed, utilized, thought about, and operated, that have been significantly improved, recently deployed, or are in development, that have the potential to change the way that nuclear order functions and nuclear operations are conducted. And of course, at the heart of this would be deterrence. So it's less about emerging or new, it's more about technologies that may have an impact alongside each other that can really transform or alter the way we manage our nuclear world. So I think the key when it comes to this challenge is trying to understand what's new, what's not, how it's new, what matters, why, to whom, because it's very different in terms of some of these technologies have very different implications or applications for different actors in different regions. Some of the states that we would talk about or we think about in this realm have very different technological capabilities and have very different national security requirements. And then, of course, to think about how we can begin to construct a way ahead. And I honestly don't have solutions today, but I do think part of how we get ahead is by trying to really understand this problem. I think it's also important, and this goes back to being careful about hype and being careful about the type of language you use, that we accept that some of these technologies are going to be more marginal than others. The impact won't necessarily be equal in terms of which particular nuclear weapons systems, which deterrent relationships, which regions, which countries are impacted. That the impact of technological change, and particularly disruptive technology, could be as much about perceptions and worst case scenario thinking as about what is deployed and what actually happens. I think that's, again, it's not something that's new, but I think becomes particularly acute in this new era that we're moving into. And also the fact that the impact of these technologies will be both deliberate. Some states will choose to deploy certain capabilities that will have a deliberate, probably destabilizing effect, but perhaps more so that many of the impacts will be inadvertent. And this will come through a lack of understanding of the interactions between technologies, between how they are interpreted and how it impacts deterrence, strategic stability, and nuclear order more broadly. And I guess the key thing is, and I think this is, of course, the whole reason for this series of seminars, is that disruptive and emerging technologies, or perhaps more broadly, technological change, is already impacting the ways, means, and ends of deterrence. So what I wanted to try and do was of course, just say very quickly what deterrence is, but try and put it in this framework of nuclear ages. And that's because it's part of the project that I'm working on, but I think also gives a good way of conceptualizing what is and isn't new, and what we should focus on, and the threats that most animate us have perhaps changed. So at its core, deterrence is purely the art of trying to discourage an action or event by instilling doubt or fear. So it's something that didn't arrive with nuclear weapons. It didn't begin in 1945, but has really risen to prominence because of the impact and the possible destruction that nuclear weapons could cause. So nuclear deterrence is just the latest iteration of deterrence. There are, of course, different ways you can seek to discourage an action or event of another. Nuclear weapons are not the only way of doing this, as we'll come on to. So deterrence is more than simply nuclear deterrence. But the reason of thinking about this challenge in terms of these nuclear ages, which I'll explain in a moment, and I'll also, with the caveat that they are by no means a perfect encapsulation of what has happened at any point, it does show where the focus of attention, the main concerns, and the sort of major flashpoints in nuclear order have been at any point in our nuclear history. So this is a kind of a very Western idea, or very Western attempt to periodize nuclear history, but the idea is that a first nuclear age existed between 1945 and 1990, was broadly synonymous with the Cold War. The major risk here was a large-scale nuclear exchange between the two superpowers, the Western Bloc led by the United States and the Eastern Bloc led by the Soviet Union. And after a couple of decades, the idea or the condition of mutual vulnerability through MAD and secure second strikes began to take hold, and that this would come the centerpiece of nuclear order in the first nuclear age. And most actions or most thinking in the first nuclear age was geared towards ensuring that central nuclear balance. Of course, we had the NPT, we have various different movements towards disarmament, but it was that maintaining that central balance and stability through nuclear forces that was absolutely essential. And nuclear weapons, of course, were the absolutely fundamental part of this, albeit deterrence does rely on other factors as well, but nuclear weapons were front and center of how nuclear order was operated. We then, or at least some would have, that we moved, or nuclear order shifted with the end of the Cold War in 1990, 1991. And our focus as scholars and our focus as policymakers, again, particularly in the Western world, began to shift or began to look at different types of nuclear risk, proliferation to rogue states or irrational actors, possibly states or even non-state actors, but particularly to different regions and away from that central focus on the Euro-Atlantic, which had been so prominent in the first nuclear age, the Middle East, South Asia, and Northeast Asia. And while the nuclear challenges in those regions didn't begin in 1990, India and Pakistan, for example, probably had nuclear capability well before that time, and of course Israel did as well. What this was trying to suggest is this is where we now need to look. This is the central place. This is the most important threat within nuclear order. Naturally, our ideas about deterrence or ideas about deterrence began to shift. MAD, or mutual vulnerability, would remain to some extent the centerpiece of US-Russia relations and, to a lesser extent, US-China, but this would be augmented by new tailored or slightly diversified concepts of deterrence that may involve active missile defenses and the possibility of deterrence by denial in different ways. This again was mainly in the US lexicon, but it was a beginning of a shift in how we saw deterrence, and a beginning of a shift away from nuclear weapons as being the major factor or the major key determinant within deterrence. So the argument that I would make, and I think the way of trying to conceptualize this emerging technology challenge, is to think of it as being the centerpiece of a third nuclear age, of a new chapter in our nuclear story. Now, this may or may not have begun around 2020. I don't think the date is absolutely essential. Nuclear ages bleed into one another. Things don't just disappear. But it does seem to me that we have or are living through a period of distinct change. So in this new nuclear period, I think that we now have to focus away from necessarily major war between the two Cold War adversaries, and at the same time away from simply looking at regions and proliferation, but towards the impact of new technologies and how this is changing deterrence relationships and changing stability, changing proliferation between all nuclear armed states, and indeed some that are non-nuclear armed as well, and the new vulnerabilities, uncertainties that they are going to create. And of course, this means that we may well be on the cusp of requiring a new concept of deterrence, strategic stability, and indeed of some of the central pillars of nuclear order, of which we've relied upon for the best part of 5 decades. And we are already beginning to see the emergence of both nuclear and non-nuclear deterrence through both denial and punishment. So a real move away from those ideas that were enshrined in the 1960s to something that is slightly more complex, more fluid, and more diverse. And what we are therefore seeing is that for some countries, the role of nuclear weapons in deterrence is being augmented and may even be replaced by other nuclear capabilities. Not so much now, but you can certainly see the trajectories of this going into the future. And what I thought I would do today, given that this is the sort of the start of the seminar series, is to look at a number of different applications where I think deterrence is being challenged by some of these emerging technologies. So the first thing that is really worth focusing on is how significant advances in sensor technology, data processing, the ability to hit targets very, very quickly anywhere in the world has completely changed. And this is having massive, or could have massive, implications for secure second strike forces, the likes of which were absolutely fundamental to deterrence with nuclear weapons in the first nuclear age. Some of this, and we'll come on to this later in the talk, is being augmented by much quicker computers, the ability to process lots more data, and of course, in some cases, by the use of artificial intelligence as well. It is also a reflection of the fact that delivery systems, precision, and all the sensors and support systems that allow for this are making delivery systems much more accurate. So you have on one level the ability to track, find, process, and on the other side, the ability to strike, hit, maybe see what's happened and strike again. And perhaps most importantly, the potential ability to do this without reliance on nuclear weapons. It was probably possible to attack certain nuclear systems or an adversary's, or it certainly was in theory possible to attack an adversary's nuclear systems in the past, but this would almost certainly have to be done with nuclear weapons because of the problems of accuracy, and there would certainly be no guarantee that you would destroy what you intended to hit. Now, part of the reason for this, the sort of the vulnerability that was surrounding this, states began to rely on different types of delivery systems that would be very, very difficult to preemptively attack. The two best examples of these, but by no means the only ones, are mobile ballistic missiles or mobile missiles. They're able to move around and hide, and very quiet, normally nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed submarines. There is evidence to suggest that some of the submarines and mobile missiles may have been slightly more vulnerable than traditional or classical thinking suggests, but I think this was only really in relation to one actor, and that would be the United States' ability to conduct this. Again, I think things are changing today because of developments in all of these support systems that allow potentially to find, find, target, track, and potentially destroy these systems that for a long, long time have been thought of as being invulnerable. There's a number of ways of doing this: undersea acoustics, the use of uninhabited underwater or aerial vehicles, the problems around choke points, particularly for submarines, incredibly good in intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and imaging satellites, a broader reliance on space, and a whole host of other ways that you might be able to find both missiles and submarines. And this has been something I think particularly acute for the debate here in the United Kingdom, a state that relies on just one delivery system, which is a nuclear submarine, only has 4 of them, of which one is always on patrol all of the time. So a significant breakthrough in this space would be very, very acute for the United Kingdom and its belief in the sanctity and security of its nuclear deterrent. But I think what sometimes gets a little bit lost from this debate is it's not a one-size-fits-all thing, and this is a theme that will come out across many of the different technologies that we'll talk about today. And it really does, when it comes to anti-submarine or threats to nuclear-armed submarines, it really does depend on where, on whose missiles or whose submarines, where they are, and who is doing the finding. But my personal belief is that US and UK subs are probably still fairly invulnerable. They're very quiet. They benefit from good access to deep water. And of course, the ocean is very, very large once you can get out there and go and hide. It's slightly more problematic for Russia and China due to choke points and due to access to deep water. Russia, I think, has in the past and may even do now keep its submarines within a bastion because of this. And China is still working out how to deal with some of these problems of leaving port without being tracked. So it kind of depends. It depends whose submarines and it depends who's doing the finding. Likewise, or on the flip side, Russia and China are increasingly reliant on mobile missiles, and these could be hidden, of course, in vast areas. This is one of the massive benefits of geography. Russian and Chinese missiles could literally be deployed anywhere that there are roads or railways with which to transport them upon. They could also, of course, be hidden in mountains or camouflaged, or lots of decoys be deployed, or very, very many other ways of which finding them be very, very difficult. One example where this may be more true is, for example, the United States and allies trying to locate and destroy North Korean missiles. Again, geography is important here. North Korea is not a very, very small country, but it is probably small enough where you can keep surveillance to a certain level that you might be able to track a small number of missiles with a reasonable amount of confidence to do so. So again, this counterforce or second strike challenge really is about who, where, and what. There's also, I think, a really important point here that the sensors and capabilities used that might be used to undermine second strike forces don't exist in a vacuum. Your adversary or an adversary would clearly be trying as hard as possible to make it as difficult for you to do this as they can. There is also, of course, the fact that you would need very good endurance. You would need your satellites or various other potentially uninhabited vehicles to be in the right place at the right time. It would become more difficult against larger nuclear arsenals where you have to be confident that you would be able to destroy everything. Any non-nuclear strike, which is increasingly being thought of as part of the prompt strike mission in the United States and possibly by others, would have to be incredibly accurate. It wouldn't have the ability to be slightly less accurate than an attack with a nuclear weapon. might provide. So there are a lot of different reasons why we should be slightly wary of claims that second strike forces are being undermined. That said, I do think this is something that is going in one direction, is as the fact that it will get easier to find missiles. It probably will get easier to find submarines. So I think that definitely, and certainly not least in this country, we should not be complacent about the invulnerability of these types of systems going forward. Of course, I focused here on just two systems or two types of systems that are used as secure second strikes. But of course, any nuclear weapons system is theoretically vulnerable, particularly if it is not well concealed, or is not hidden, or is not mobile. But I think really importantly, and again, this sometimes gets lost, it doesn't change the political calculation that attacks on any type of force, or any type particularly of nuclear weapon, would be potentially suicidal. You would have to be incredibly confident, or things would have to be incredibly bad for this to seem like a good idea. The second issue I want to look at today, and I think it really encapsulates some of the emerging or disruptive and emerging technology hype, and certainly the debate that surrounds it, and also the very clear link with deterrence. And this is hypersonic missiles. They seem to embody all of the things that we're worried about. They seem to be quick, new, they go travel in different directions, a whole host of things which seem to be very exotic, very new, very challenging. They've been touted as the way to get round ballistic missile defenses, to be able to attack with very little warning. So therefore, for surprise, they could be very accurate. They could maneuver to hit different targets that you never expected. And all of this seems to come together and suggest that here is something that's going to be quite significant, albeit, I think, as I'll mention in a minute, possibly reinforcing rather than necessarily undermining deterrence. I think the interesting thing, well, actually, before I said that, there are two types of hypersonic weapons, and they are quite different. So I think it's quite useful to distinguish them. And so one is a hypersonic glide vehicle. A hypersonic glide vehicle is essentially boosted by a rocket in a similar way to a ballistic missile warhead, before gliding across or just near to the top of the atmosphere and falling to its target. So the majority of its flight path is not powered. It's only that initial bit that it's powered. A hypersonic cruise missile is slightly different because it stays inside the atmosphere. It relies on an air-breathing scramjet engine and is powered throughout the whole duration of its flight. It's probably more difficult to make a hypersonic cruise missile. It's certainly more difficult to make a long-range hypersonic cruise missile because it has to carry its own fuel. So they are two slightly different types of capability. And if you'll see on the right-hand side, it's quite small, but gives you an idea of the sort of trajectories that the missiles, the hypersonic missiles follow, as compared with the ballistic missile, which follows the traditional curve. But and I'm by no means the first person to say this, but I think what's quite interesting is just how little about hypersonic missiles is really that new, both in terms of the types of capabilities, glide vehicles and cruise missiles themselves, but also in how similar they are to current ballistic missiles and cruise missiles. This, I think, probably isn't helped by the hypersonic moniker. I mean, hypersonic really does just refer to a particular speed, Mach 5 and faster, or around about 6,000 kilometers an hour or faster. And the reality is that many ballistic missile warheads already travel at this speed. So actually the difference in speed is not really that significant. There are many other similarities as well. So current ballistic missiles have certain capabilities to evade defenses, can to more or lesser extent maneuver, particularly if deployed with multiple maneuverable re-entry vehicles, and can of course also be deployed on depressed trajectories, which would decrease the time that it took to reach their targets. So there are a number of similarities, and hypersonic cruise missiles really are just a faster version of cruise missiles. Cruise missiles are already able to maneuver, to change target, and as we'll come on to later, have some very sophisticated guidance systems as well. There's also a number of kind of limitations to the idea of hypersonic missiles. And I was on a panel yesterday where we talked a bit about this, and it seems as much as anything, hypersonic technology is being driven by politics, geopolitics, grandstanding, as much as it really is anything else. It's been clearly linked with defeating missile defenses, but many people would argue, many specialists and experts on this topic would argue that actually current sophisticated missiles already can defeat most missile defenses. There are also a number of other aspects that are worth flagging up. So hypersonic glide vehicle, because it is only powered during that first part of flight, will slow when maneuvering through the atmosphere. it will lose speed as it does this, and slow as it descends through the atmosphere to hit its target. And this potentially makes it more susceptible to terminal ballistic missile defense systems. It may be able to evade mid-course, which are the bits that would try and shoot it down in space, but more susceptible as it was getting towards its target. There are significant problems of how to deal with the heat produced by both glide vehicles and hypersonic cruise missiles because of the different trajectories. They produce a lot more heat than a ballistic missile warhead. Shielding ballistic missile warheads from heat is already very, very difficult. Shielding glide vehicles and cruise missile and hypersonic cruise missiles from the heat make this very, very difficult too, possibly harder. It also means, because they produce so much heat, that they're potentially easier to track with infrared sensors, and if you have, particularly if they're from space, and therefore potentially to counter with slightly different advanced missile defense systems too. It's a possibility that both missiles would rely upon GPS or other global positioning data for precision and guidance. This again is a problem due to the heat. It will only be at a certain point in flight that GPS or a similar system would probably be able to communicate with the warhead. And of course, it opens up the possibility that the GPS signal could be jammed or interfered with, or of course, it depends whether it's using a civilian or much more hardened military signal to do this. Glide vehicles are probably easier than hypersonic cruise missiles, and again, probably especially in terms of intercontinental ranges and for sort of the strategic missions that we might think of. So what does this mean? Well, it suggests to me that hypersonic missiles don't obviously undermine deterrence, and in some ways might even enhance it. If Russian pursuit, for example, of hypersonic missiles increases their confidence that they can always defeat a US missile defense system, then I don't necessarily see how this really changes anything. In fact, it may just make that kind of mutual vulnerability, stability through mutual vulnerability, even stronger rather than less. Yes, of course, there are complications and issues about using hypersonic weapons for strategic strikes, either with or strategic precision bolt out of the blue strikes against nuclear assets or command and control. But again, I don't necessarily see this as being that different from the type of possibilities offered by current ballistic and cruise missiles. Where I do think there is a real issue around hypersonics is one, the clear fact that this is an area of proliferation and possibly arms racing, but also the increased misperception and the possibility of inadvertent escalation. The worry is that hypersonic weapons may be deployed in both nuclear and non-nuclear guise, may be deployed in the same place on the same delivery vehicles, and this really will raise concerns in a crisis about what type of warhead, what type of missile is being used and where. There is, of course, the flip side of this is that because, for example, a glide vehicle relies on a booster much in the same way as a ballistic missile, it could well be brought into existing arms control agreements that we currently have. A New Start or New Start follow-on would be very clear examples of this. A third aspect that I wanted to touch on today, and I think this is why it's so important that we don't get too focused on the emerging aspect of this challenge, is ballistic missile defense. And of course, ballistic missile defense has been around since the 1940s, began when the UK started being attacked by the Nazi V-bombs, and it's never really gone away since. It took a while for the idea or the sort of the conception that BMD was destabilizing, and of course, this was enshrined in the 1972 ABM Treaty, the idea being that by limiting ballistic missile defenses, you could ensure a certain level of vulnerability that would create stability that may lead to reduction in tensions and possibly arms control as well. But I think what's changing today, well, two things are changing this today. So BMD is not new, but the acceptance, normalization, and spread of BMD technology that we know of, which we can term as right of launch, so that is radar, satellites, kinetic interceptors, it has been quite significant in the last 20 years. In 2001, 2002, the US left the ABM Treaty and has pushed ahead with developing a range of different types of ballistic missile defenses. And this has, of course, already been problematic in relation to Russia, and indeed to a lesser extent with China. But what has also happened, perhaps with less focus, is that many other states have also adapted and accepted and begun developing ballistic missile defense systems for various purposes as well. Not all of them to defeat non-nuclear long-range missiles, but increasingly seeing defense and ballistic missile defense as being a credible part of a national security and in some cases deterrent posture. Part of the reason for this is while the technology still clearly isn't perfect, it is getting better. It really does depend on which missions you are using particular technologies for. And some of it also depends on the type of adversary and type of threats that you're likely to face against. So the first part of this challenge, and again, it's not emerging, but it is a change, is the right of launch. That is the ability or the desire to shoot down a missile after it has been launched is getting better, is getting normalized, is becoming more widespread. So if you like, that's part one. The second part, and in my mind, far more worrying, is the emergence of so-called left of launch and an idea or a desire for full spectrum ballistic missile defense. Now, the idea of left of launch is rather than waiting for a missile to be launched and try and shoot it down, as with right of launch, you try and stop the launch happening at all. This may be done via computer network operations or so-called cyber, by hacking into systems, messing around in command and control apparatus, lacing missiles or guidance systems or a whole host of other things with malware or things that would go wrong. This is essentially a mixture of the worst possible or the most worrying versions of cyber war in the nuclear realm, and also the digital version of kind of counterforce preemptive strike, the idea that was around, the ideas of preemption and prevention that were around 20 years ago have now sort of come back, I think, with this idea of left of launch. Of course, right. So right of launch has already caused problems, as I've mentioned. It's linked with the development of hypersonic weapons, particularly in Russia. It's linked also with a number of other Russian systems, including the nuclear-powered cruise missile, the Poseidon underwater drone, and various other things as well. So it's already having an impact, not necessarily in undermining deterrence, but certainly in creating or undermining stability and driving arms racing as either party or different parties move to try and ensure that they're not vulnerable to any type of new technology. There has always been, and this really does depend who you speak to, but even despite the impact that right of launch missile defense has had, particularly US right of launch, this has always been tempered a little bit by a lack of confidence in the technology and mission and how these systems can be overwhelmed. I don't think many people would argue that the US trying to build a leak-proof nationwide shield against current Russian nuclear arsenal is in any way feasible or possible at all. It'd be very easily overwhelmed in many ways. But there is always, I think, this fear of what might come next. So it suggests to me that right of launch, or what we've traditionally thought of as missile defense, can probably be limited, may be difficult politically, but may just be limited because of the costs and the technology and everything else, and may be slow enough to be manageable before it really upsets deterrence, particularly in US-Russia relations, but perhaps also in others, US-China, deterrence relationships across Northeast Asia and in South Asia too. Left of launch, though, I think is an entirely different problem, and one that we really should be worried about. And I think this link with counterforce, with preemption, and expanding the missile defense mission beyond just responding to actually stopping something from happening is potentially really problematic. So again, this idea of left of launch creates new challenges and exacerbates the problem. Using computer network operations in various ways, or so-called cyber attacks, are far less tangible, harder to quantify, will increase suspicion. You can roughly calculate what a radar can do, or what an interceptor, the speed of an interceptor allows it to be able to intercept. It's much, much more difficult once we get into the digital cyber realm with things like this. It's also much more difficult to see who particular capabilities could be aimed against, because they're not obviously deployed in specific areas that can be seen. Again, this moves the missile defense mission, I think, away from one of defense to one probably arguably of prevention. And the non-kinetic aspect of it may mean that there are lower barriers to entry for others that want to become involved or want to do this as well. So I think this move from missile defense from the kinetic world of response to the digital world of preemption is potentially a really serious challenge to deterrence for all nuclear armed states, albeit at the moment, it only appears to be something entertained by the United States. The fourth thing I want to focus on is not so much a technology as the importance of two different realms, or as people sometimes like to say, different domains to how we think about deterrence. So deterrence and nuclear politics and nuclear order plays out in a broader ecosystem which consists of hard, tangible, and observable things such as missiles, submarines, command and control nodes, radars, etc., at the same time as soft, intangible, and secretive developments. And this is, if you like, the information space within which it all happens. This is the way that information is gleaned, signaled, understood, and the context within which all of this plays out. And what I think we're beginning to see today is an interaction of these physical and information domains in a way that just simply wasn't seen before, hasn't been seen before. And this is, of course, reflective of the more modern, data-heavy, information-led world in which we all live, where we are much closer, or we rely much more on sophisticated technology for almost every part of our everyday lives. Well, this is something that is happening in the nuclear world as well. It involves, as many others have pointed out, an increasing commingling of both nuclear and non-nuclear systems and their support systems. It also means, because of this environment or real-time nature of this environment, a compression of decision-making time and various new types of escalatory pathways, which maybe we hadn't theorized or thought about before. Indeed, even if the ones that we thought about before were actually as credible as we hoped. There seems to me a blurring of fire breaks, less commonality of understandings, and a context that is just more difficult to understand how to deter, how to convey a deterrent threat, and indeed what you need or what is required to achieve deterrence. This may be looking back with rose-tinted spectacles on a previous era and suggesting it was easier to understand deterrence then, but I just think it's become more complicated now. Two classic examples of this are the increasing importance of space when it comes to thinking about nuclear order and deterrence. Of course, space has been important for various aspects of the nuclear mission and deterrence missions for a long time, not least in terms of early warning. But we are seeing, I think, a renewed interest in counter space, and particularly for adversaries of the United States, the importance of trying to blind or trying to interfere with the space-based assets that an adversary such as the United States is so dependent upon for so many different operations. One can think of space as being important to missile defense, precision strike, early warning, tracking, a whole host of things, not to mention communication and battle management and all the rest. So the importance of space, the concurrent developments in counter and anti-space capabilities, I think are creating a real concern about how this may escalate, or the importance, or this is a flashpoint of any future conflict. The US and China have already been pretty clear that they would go after either anti-space or space-based capabilities at the start of any conflict, because they're seen as so important. I think this creates a real pressure to use or lose. I don't necessarily think that we will get to a point where ASAP capabilities will make a perfect strike on space-based assets possible. For one, many space-based assets are a long, long way away, which would make kinetic engagement or kinetic ASAP very, very difficult. There are also a lot of satellites that can be repurposed, but it seems to me to be a potential problem and flashpoint, particularly if by trying to undermine a particular satellite, this was interpreted or caused an adversary to think that the threat was much more serious, or indeed was part of a nuclear first strike. So space as a domain for Earth-based deterrence, I think, is becoming increasingly important. And likewise, and I alluded to it, this information environment within which nuclear deterrence, nuclear politics, and nuclear thinking takes place is becoming more diverse. It's becoming more democratized. More actors have the potential to interfere with it, to mess around. And there just seems to me a greater worry about mis and disinformation, where in the past we may have worried about the lack of, or policymakers and decision makers would have worried about the lack of information. Today, it's quite the opposite. There is too much information, and it's understanding what is or can be relied upon and what is true or real that is the real challenge. And we've seen this already with the sort of incorporation of Twitter, and Twitter being used almost as a way of signaling the possibility of fake news or false alerts, such as the text message that was sent to residents of Hawaii several years ago, warning of a North Korean incoming missile. The emergence of deep fakes that almost anybody could make. Even I think one of my colleagues on a panel yesterday said this could be made on a smartphone. And also the whole sort of idea about the different ways in which information is shared, gleaned, signaled, interpreted has shifted. And a rather hackneyed way of thinking about this is, imagine a classic Cold War crisis such as Cuba 1962 happening today, happening in a real time, media, real-time information and news environment where there just would not be the time probably for policymakers to come to decisions that they did. Some of the revisionist history suggests that we were incredibly lucky in a number of different ways anyway in Cuba. Well, the type of environment that something like that may happen in today would suggest that it would have to be even luckier for it not to become for a cold or for a crisis not to turn hot. So I think that there's an interesting sort of move here towards a more complex space. It's less about weapons, it's more about the ecosystem and the environment and the information environment within which nuclear deterrence and operations take place. The flip side of this, and this may well be something entertained by some actors, is that this could be considered as a way of deterring actions by another party. If you can raise the risks and really blur the lines of which type of activities or which type of attacks or which systems are used for what, then you may raise the threshold to another actor trying to take action against you for fear of doing something that would exacerbate and escalate a crisis. So there are two sides to this. So I think the space is becoming more complex, deterrence is becoming more difficult, but that actually could help for some states to deter the actions of others. A fifth thing I want to touch on is AI, automation, and deterrence. So the whole idea of AI is again quite problematic because it really does depend what you mean by it. There are so many different types of applications. There is an enormous spectrum in terms of the sophistication of AI, what it's intended to do, how narrow and how focused it is compared with how broad and how much it is allowed to think and make decisions. So it really isn't a one size fits all. And this is probably highlighted by the fact that types of AI, or at least very sophisticated software, have been involved in nuclear operations for a while. Likewise, certain levels of automation, such as the so-called dead hand early warning system. I think, having said all this, the real key with AI and automation is thinking about how they might be used in the future in the different types of applications, not all of which might necessarily be bad, and some of which could have a role to play in deterrence. So it is possible to see very sophisticated computers, very sophisticated software, and uses of various artificial intelligence to help decision-making support. And this might be a good thing. Data collection analysis, the ability to be confident that a false warning was a false warning, moving us away from some of the events that worried us in the past. On the flip side, it may help improve targeting and war plans. It may be very useful in terms of finding and tracking targets, the ability to process lots of complex information, such as in an underwater environment, or to distinguish a mobile missile from something that is trying to camouflage it. AI in different ways it may be possible to use it in all of these different ways, and of course feeding into what I mentioned earlier about the possibility of hitting or holding vulnerable secure second strike forces. AI could make weapons smarter, particularly in things like guidance. It could really revolutionize things such as TERCOM, the ability for a cruise missile to look down, see if where it is matches with what it's got on its system, may be able to move, may be able to avoid interceptors as well, a whole host of different ways that we could take some of the sophisticated weaponry from the conventional domain and maybe applied to the nuclear domain. The possibility of facilitating autonomous platforms for sensors underwater or in the air or even in space or in other domains, but perhaps more worrying, the possibility also of different types of autonomous weapons. And the classic example here is the Status 6 or Poseidon nuclear armed, nuclear powered long range torpedo. AI, again, because of its sophistication of software, could well be used in left of launch operations too, could be deployed to map out an adversary's systems, find out weak points, to lace it with malware that could be used if and when somebody decided to make that decision to do so. So a whole host of different applications. And I think it's why when we talk about AI and automation, it's really much better to think about the application of it rather than of AI itself. The number of different concerns that will maybe limit the deployment or the application of these technologies in the nuclear realm, and of course its impact on deterrence. And there is a feeling, not least here in Europe, of a real descent towards killer robots, and perhaps we could even say killer nuclear robots. The sort of ideas that are reminiscent from the Terminator films, and a real fear that humans may be getting further and further away from being able to understand and control the types of systems that they're relying upon. This goes two different ways. Humans could become so confident in the decisions made by AI or by automated systems, that they just simply go along with whatever they suggest, or because of the lack of understanding of how decisions were reached, they may mistrust them. So there's a real debate going on here about where the human is in the loop and the relationship between the human and the technology, particularly in this case, if it were to be a nuclear technology. Because AI is basically software, there would be an enormous number of vulnerabilities, including hacking, possibility of jamming of autonomous vehicles, data poisoning in the training, the lack of data sets and computer power, depending on what you were trying to do. And I think perhaps above all, the unpredictability of how certain systems were making decisions. It's why what we've seen so far are, especially in the military and nuclear realm, are applications of AI that are fairly narrow, are fairly discrete, and are a long way away from the type of machine learning that we sometimes hear hyped about in the news. So I think there are good reasons why AI and automation may be limited within the nuclear space, and but it will require monitoring and oversight. But it also suggests that if we can work towards avoiding the most dangerous applications for all of us, that the impacts on deterrence could be limited. So I thought I put this slide in here. It draws on some other work that I've done with a colleague of mine, Ben Zara, and it's about thinking, if we accept that we've got a number of different technological pressures changing the nuclear world, changing deterrence and nuclear order, then what might the future look like? And this is by no means exact. There may be other scenarios that people can think of, but we thought we would do this as a thought experiment, just to sort of map out, well, where might we go in the future? And I suppose importantly, if there is a particular future that we would like to try and prioritize, that we would need to work towards, because of course, understanding the problem is one thing, trying to respond and mitigate is another. So the first is that these emerging and disruptive technologies basically cause nuclear proliferation, and this leads to periods of strategic instability, arms racing, investment in various new capabilities, both nuclear and non-nuclear. And this probably is kind of where we are today and seems most likely. So this is a bit of a damning for arms control, certainly for disarmament, possibly not catastrophic, but something that wouldn't be welcomed in terms of global stability. Deterrence would probably be maintained. It would just be maintained at higher levels than it is today. As part of this, we could see a period or periods where one state gains a perceived strategic advantage because of the development of different emerging and disruptive technologies, perhaps alongside nuclear weapons as well. And this may create the possibility of coercion or even a non-nuclear first strike capability. And this clearly would be the most destabilizing for nuclear order and the most problematic for deterrence. It could come it could come as part of a broader trend of both EDT and nuclear proliferation. But I think this would be a very worrying place that we could get to. It seems most likely that would be the United States that would be in this position, but it could be others as we look ahead. It's by no means a foregone conclusion that Western dominance over these types of technologies will continue, or indeed if that's exactly where we are today. A third scenario is that we somehow have restraint in the development of these different technologies. This may be done through new types of arms control, risk reduction and normative mechanisms. It will probably need revisiting, or we will need to revisit the type of architectures we have now. Expanding doesn't necessarily mean getting rid of them, but understanding that new challenges may need new types of responses. This may be the most appealing from where we are now. It would minimize probably the impact of emerging and disruptive technologies on nuclear order, but it would probably remain a nuclear order because nuclear weapons would therefore remain a central currency for the major powers. A fourth, probably least likely, but most transformative scenario would be the development and deployment of all sorts of different emerging and disruptive technologies eventually leads us to a point of stability whereby these technologies become the go-to resource for states, not nuclear weapons. So we could see a point in the future where nuclear weapons are superseded by these different types of tech, either because they're undermined or they don't produce the same effect or various other reasons, and that this would be the pathway to a nuclear disarmed world. Now, it's not very obvious how we would get there without any major crisis. This is, of course, one of the classic problems of how we ever move towards deterrence. And of course, this could be a world that was more ripe or ready or primed for non-nuclear conflict through the use of EDT, and may require a complete change in how we think about deterrence and how we think about stability. That seems to me something for the long run. It's more hypothetical, but it is something as a thought experiment that we could possibly get to. So just to bring this all together and lead us into the questions, this is a technological, or we've framed this as a technological problem, and there is a feeling that it is technological determinism, and that the move towards developing and deploying all these different emerging and disruptive tech is somehow almost irresistible or inevitable. And that this, of course, is creating a nuclear order that is in flux, it's creating problems for deterrence, potentially more dangerous, creating challenges that we probably are finding it difficult to try and understand. But ultimately, these are political problems. And I think while we may be entering into a new period in our nuclear story, and as I've said and argued elsewhere, a possible third nuclear age where we have to look at different challenges and come up with different remedies, this is a political problem, and it is politics that drives this ultimately. Nevertheless, if we don't act, we are likely to see a number of quite worrying developments. A blurring, not necessarily replacement, of nuclear and non-nuclear deterrence. New pathways for probably inadvertent escalation through entanglement and indistinguishability of warheads, of targets, of a whole host of other things as well. Greater uncertainty and less tangible threats, and the possible rise of non-nuclear first strike capabilities, whether they be through conventional weapons or unconventional non-kinetic weapons. Potentially a shifting balance between humans and machines, and definitely a shift between, or a reduction in, human understanding of the types of machines and capabilities that they are using for the political means that they wish. Increasing speed of operations and a reduction in decision-making time for policymakers. Again, this overload of information rather than the problem of yesteryear, which was too little. And I think perhaps most importantly, a difficulty for policymakers to keep up to date with understanding this tech and its implications. This is a fast-moving thing. It is something that can no longer be hijacked by political or social scientists such as myself. This is a whole of society thing that we need the smartest people from all different backgrounds to be engaged in. That said, some of these technologies are more established than is sometimes acknowledged. Some of what we see are new versions of old problems. Deterrence has never been something that is exact and settled. It has always been fluid. It has always meant slightly different things. But I think unless we're careful, and we certainly shouldn't be sit idly by, we may enter into a new nuclear environment where nuclear risks unfold. And it seems to me, just to finish up, that political will, informed decision makers, and a vibrant climate of ideas, hopefully through initiatives such as this by the VCDNP, are absolutely essential for us to do that. And I'll stop there. I hope I haven't gone too much over time. Hand back to Elena and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Andrew. That is, gosh, an amazing overview of all the technologies and challenges and their impact or absence of, or kind of minimum impact. But definitely you touched upon a lot of different aspects of both the technologies and their kind of complexity of these issues and their interaction. There are a number of questions that have been submitted in advance to our webinar, and there is a Q&A functions for those who are watching, and I already see a number of questions there, but those who still want to submit their questions, please do use the Q&A function for that. I will start with, first of all, a clarifying question that came from one of our listeners today. Is it's on the terminology itself. Sometimes people refer to emerging and disruptive technologies, and you refer to that as well, emerging disruptive technologies. But some people see disruptive as a destabilizing or equal them. But from what I understand, disruptive means a little bit of different thing in the kind of those who deal with this issue. So I would probably ask you to clarify what you mean by disruptive technologies. And the other question, a little bit more, probably requiring a little bit more answering, is while the deterrence is indeed, we're looking at the deterrence between the states parties, but the impact or access to some of these technologies by non-state actors and their ability to influence both the technology development or manipulation of certain technologies, or interfere, like a new set of actors now entering in. And I'm sure you've done some research on that, and I would really like to hear your views on non-state actors and how they figure in all these calculations. I'll pause here and collect a few more questions.
Great, thank you. So I think I rather unashamedly set this talk up as looking at the destabilizing factors or problems or challenges to deterrence, rather than thinking much about how new technologies can enhance deterrence. And I think there are ways that different technologies can, and I think that's why the labeling is quite important. Emerging technologies can, I think, have both positive and negative implications. Disruptive, I think, makes a case of saying these are probably going to have largely destabilizing or bad implications for whatever's going on, and the way, and again, I think that's why that labeling is so important. There is, and I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but there are a number of ways that you could use various different emerging technologies for good things, and there are work out there as well. Verification would be an example of this, something I know is close to the heart of many people at VCDNP, but a number of other ways as well. Buying decision-making time, possibly through use of, or being more confident about the type of data and early warning, and a whole host of other things as well. It's possibility that in strange ways, such as I mentioned with hypersonic weapons, that what are perceived as destabilizing or disruptive technologies actually enhance deterrence. If you enhance mutual vulnerability, and the emphasis on mutual, then actually that can be something that is broadly beneficial. But the way I understand it are capabilities that are not necessarily brand new, although some of these things are new, but it's different versions of old challenges. It's things that can impact and make us rethink about the central axioms, the central ideas that we base nuclear order on. So a lot of this is, dreamed up in the 1960s about how deterrence works, what strategic stability is, how we get arms control, the order, the best way of managing nuclear weapons, and the type of order that's embodied by the NPT and whatever else. So it's just trying to think of the different ways, thinking through what it means. So as I say, I kind of unashamedly didn't try and think of positives out of this, although I think there are some. But I will also reiterate the fact that these are political decisions. So how technology doesn't automatically have a negative, disruptive, or good value. It is how it's deployed and what is done with it, and the politics that underpin it as well. And I think there's a much broader question there about not getting too focused on technology, but about the politics, the geopolitics, and the thinking that surrounds it. The question about non-state actors is a really, really important one, and I think it's absolutely right that some of these dynamics are changing the ability for non-state actors to interfere in the nuclear process. But clearly this is different for different technologies. So I don't see hypersonic weapons having much of an impact on non-state actor threats, but the broader information space, the possibility of deep fakes, of false flag attacks, of creating or causing misperception, really are something that the non-state actors can do. And I think this is something in sort of, if you like, cyberspace or the cyber realm that's particularly acute. It's the ability to indirectly impact. Of course, the whole issue around non-state actors is it depends what type of non-state actors you're talking about, what type of goals they have, whether they're a group which is simply seeking to cause mass destruction, or one that has got territorial political aims. That's going to mean different things. So I don't necessarily think it hugely changes deterrence against some of these groups or from them, but it might change the ability to be confident in managing deterrence relationships because of their interference, particularly in times of crisis.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I'm gonna ask you a couple of additional questions, and while I'm collecting, summarizing, and try to kind of compile questions by the group. One is related to the application of what you've discussed to other regions. Like we're mainly talking about deterrence and instability in the US-Russia, US-China context. But what about other nuclear weapon states and nuclear possessive states, particularly with regards, say, to South Asian theater, where it's particularly close. It's the distance is right next door. And the second question is related, and I know you've done quite a lot of work on it, is the impact of some of these cyber and information technologies and AR on the command and control. So to speak a little bit more about that. So I will stop here. These are big questions, and I'll get back with more questions.
No, I think the first point is absolutely fundamental. I'm a bit disappointed myself for not using more examples that aren't purely about the Euro-Atlantic or US-China, because I think, one, that is a trap that many, particularly Western scholars, fall into, is just assuming that this only matters between the US, Russia, NATO, and China. Of course, it does matter in that context, but it is not the only context. And I guess, secondly, and linked to that, that one of the arguments that I would make about this third nuclear age, of which these technological challenges are part, is that this is very much a global phenomenon, a global experience, maybe at different speeds, at different paces, with different implications across the world, but it is definitely global. And not least because actually the United States has interests in, and certainly deterrence interests in most of the other nuclear regions of the world anyway, so Middle East, South Asia, indirectly South Asia, and Northeast Asia as well, but also because those states are also interested in some of these capabilities. So I mentioned in the presentation that many other states are now interested in active ballistic missile defenses. India is a classic example of this, interested in various different types of defense and that nuclear balance and the deterrence relationship in that region is constantly evolving as both sides seek to find some way of kind of either achieving superiority or just trying to rebalance. And it is entirely possible, although there's less written about it, but I have spoken to people, that some of these other technologies will be deployed or will become important in that region as well. And I think we've already seen to some extent the importance of the information environment there as well, about how messages are signaled, about how crises or about how actions are reported, interpreted. And you're absolutely right that South Asia is a classic example of where the problems are exacerbated because of geography, because of the fact that you have two nuclear armed states that share a border. This is very different from the United States and Russia, particularly in an ICBM era where there was comparatively a lot more time to respond, to react, to think. Things may happen much, much quicker in these regions. And likewise, I think in Northeast Asia, we're beginning to see interest from some states in strategic conventional weaponry, Japan and missile defense, cyber operations, as a balance is kind of, or as there's moves to try and retain a balance in deterrence relationship with China, managing North Korea, the US reassuring allies in that region, not least recently with the UK-US submarine deal with Australia. So there's a lot of different things going on, and I think you're absolutely right to point out that this is not just a Euro-Atlantic issue, albeit a lot of the examples we give are from there, but this is being mirrored, albeit perhaps slightly slowly and maybe catching up in other parts of the world. So I think the emerging disruptive tech, and definitely the third nuclear age, is a genuinely global nuclear age where these technologies and the political interactions are something that's happening globally, not just not just something that we need to focus on here in the Western world. Oh, and sorry, and then the cyber question as well. I got carried away with that one.
Command and control.
Yeah, I mean, this is a massive problem. And I think there was I think it's been better addressed now. It's a massive problem for states that keep weapons on high levels of alert. It's a massive problem for states that are interested in modernizing nuclear weapons infrastructure and command and control infrastructure, particularly digitizing and making more complex and increasing functionality in a whole host of different ways. and I made the comment in a talk that I gave yesterday about this, that there was much derision of some of these old systems where 8-inch floppy disks were used to communicate within the US nuclear enterprise, and the big sort of cupboard-sized computers that we used, analog machines. They're obviously now being replaced by microchips and things that are much smaller, but these are much less easy to understand, much less easy to understand if they've been tampered with or hacked in some way, but also if things just go wrong. The possibility of hacking into nuclear command and control has got to be there. Do I think it's easy to do? No. Do I think it's likely? No. Is it something that could happen? Yeah, you can't prove that it can't be done. It's kind of implicit in the full spectrum and left of launch BMD concept of trying to use cyber, or it's basically a nicer way of saying we would like to use cyber attacks to undermine your nuclear missile systems. And it's possible the United States and allies did this against North Korea when a North Korean missile test failed, although, as people will say, there's a whole host of reasons why missile tests fail. But it's a really dangerous thing, I think. And there's two types of risks within this. So there's one of the nation state on nation state, which is trying to hack in to disable or stop something happening. So to stop a missile being launched, to stop an early warning system working, or what have you, to try and seek an advantage that way. But perhaps the more worrying is these enabling type of attacks that a non-state actor might do. Non-state actors will probably be much less capable in this space, but have ways of doing this. And that is to try and exacerbate a crisis or to do things in other ways that might cause a nuclear launch or a disaster. So there are a number of challenges around this to nuclear C2, which are not being helped by modernization, are not helped by keeping weapons systems and the need to make decisions quickly, and are not sometimes helped by the inability of what's often phrased as the right and left hand to speak to each other within these organizations. So the people that do the nuclear stuff and the people that do the cyber stuff quite often literally don't speak to each other. I think that's changing, but it's so important that the different sides of that coin, if you like, understand the different vulnerabilities and the different challenges posed by the different from the different realms.
Thank you, Andrew. And a couple more, I think, very interesting questions that I would like to pose to you. Again, I'm grouping several of the questions coming from different individuals. The prospects for arms control, for including some of these technologies into either folding them into the existing kind of arms control structures, which are not that many, but also because many of these technologies are being acquired by a large number of states, and sometimes it's non-state, it's private companies and businesses that acquire them. So how do you see prospects for arms control or some kind of controls in this area? And I'll stop here, and then we'll give you one-by-one questions depending on how much time remains until the end of the webinar.
It's a great question, and I think there are probably others that are much better placed to comment on that than me, that have worked on it. I know Heather Williams has done some work on this, and a number of others have as well. I guess the important thing to point out is arms control is not a one-size-fits-all thing. Arms control doesn't have to look like it has done in the past. Arms control is a toolkit, and some types of some technologies or some applications of these technologies will be easier to control or more obvious how they can be controlled than others. I think, again, the terminology is really important here. Two examples that sometimes come up are cyber arms control or AI arms control, both of which are essentially meaningless because they cover so many different things that it just doesn't make sense. It's about thinking about applications or thinking about targets or thinking about risks. It's also, I think, in some of this space, discussing and finding what are the things that we all don't want to happen. And that might sound really obvious, but something, as we mentioned a minute ago, about non-state actors messing around in nuclear command and control systems doesn't really benefit anybody. So what can be done to move that forward? And I think the other thing that we've got to be wary of, or we've got to be sort of keep in mind, is that arms control can be done in many different ways. I mean, ideally, you would have something that is verifiable, something that can be counted, something that is legally binding, but it doesn't have to be. Arms control, if you go back and look at some of the seminal texts of arms control or how it's applied, it doesn't have to be any of those. It doesn't have to be legally binding. It could be unilateral. It can be essentially anything that reduces, the likelihood of war, the cost of war, and sort of the things that surround it. So anything that states can do individually, bilaterally, multilaterally, that help reduce that can be important. And even something that really strikes me with a lot of these issues and sort of the whole emerging technology thing is it's about education as much as anything else. That, while it may not seem like an arms control mechanism, getting the public to understand, getting policymakers to understand the possible applications or how certain uses of these technologies may be understood and what it could cause is absolutely essential. So I think it's, if there's one takeaway, it's don't think of arms control as having to be New START, albeit some hypersonic missiles or may be able to be counted under that, but seeing it something much more broadly that is about reducing risk and about reducing possibilities of war and around that. And I think some of that is to do with education.
Thank you, Andrew. And I would just add to that, another kind of side of it is that many of these technologies are actually extremely beneficial in other areas of life. So finding that balance would also be extremely difficult. Like, how do you really focus on the potential negative impact?
It's why I think
at the same time allow for some of these technologies contribute to prosper and development.
It's why I think two things are really important. It's about application of technology and how it's used or how it's done. And it's about, sometimes it's about thinking about pathways to nuclear use or pathways to crises rather than about technologies. And thinking about how do we mitigate that. So it may not be about banning things, it may not be about stopping people building things or doing stuff. It's about particular types of actions or activities that can be particularly dangerous.
Yes, and very good question from Team Thais. Rose Guttemüller has recently used the concept of a standstill conundrum. The idea that nuclear forces will indeed become more vulnerable, but that this will happen for all sides, more or less at the same time. Do we then overstate the danger of emerging technologies and what they pose to stability of deterrence? And should we instead focus on the increased mutual vulnerability?
I think all nuclear armed states and forces will be impacted. I don't think it will be uniform and the same across different systems, different contexts, and different actors. And I think from the vantage point of the moment, the US is still in the lead or would seek to benefit from a shift away from a nuclear order based on mutual vulnerability of nuclear weapons to one where there is a greater role or greater capacity for non-nuclear weapons. And this is, you could argue this is something that's always been part of the US debate, is how do you break out of the condition of mad and how do you find different ways of doing it? So I think that it's correct that it will impact everybody. I don't think it's impact everyone in the same degree. And a good example of that would be submarines, right? If you can build quieter submarines, if you have better access to deep water, if you have better ability to track an adversaries or at least prevent an adversary from entering into a certain area, then your submarines are not going to be as vulnerable as others. Where I think, well, another example of that would be, to some extent, your vulnerability to cyber or computer network operations or hackers kind of depends on how you've built your systems, what you're trying to do, the vulnerabilities that are in there, how sophisticated they are, how open you are, what you're trying to do. So yes, everyone will be impacted, but I think in different ways. And I think at the current vantage point, it still favors the United States, although I think we may see in the medium term a leveling up across this space because of the development of emerging technology, development of different types of technical capabilities by different actors.
I know that everybody, a number of people have it on their mind, but and it's kind of come across in several questions. It's like, among all the technologies that you discussed today, which one, in your view, has or may have in the near future the most kind of destabilizing impact or disruptive impact on strategic stability?
It's difficult because it's context dependent. I think I'm very worried about the use of computer network operations for full spectrum missile defense and preemption. I'm really concerned about where that leads to in terms of deterrence, instability, and a whole host of other things. And I don't think the idea will go away unless we find some way of agreeing not to do it. That's a worry. I worry a lot about the possibility, and I'm emphasis on the possibility, of increasingly autonomous types of systems within the nuclear space. Now, most actors have said that this is not something they're interested in. They're not interested in autonomous delivery systems for nuclear weapons. But I could see this becoming more and more possible and something that states rely upon. And that opens up a whole Pandora's box about how you ensure command and control and how you ensure security and everything else. But I think perhaps the thing that concerns me the most, and it's not really a technology, it's more the information context or environment that we live in. So we do live in a world now where, you know, something like we're doing here just wasn't really feasible 20 years ago, and possibly even sooner. We live in a world where people can say things and do things which will instantly have an impact somewhere else. We live in a world where many people now can have their voices heard. We live in a world where people's decisions and how they understand the world can be manipulated in ways that just simply weren't possible in the past. And I think there's a real concern around how any future crisis will play out in, if you like, information space, social media, and a whole host of other things. And I really don't think we've got to grips with how that impacts decision-making, crises, the speed at which decisions are made, how populations may respond to perceptions of decisions that are made, and a whole host of things. And I actually think it's that context as much as it's any particular weapon or system that really worries me. How we get around that, I don't know, particularly in societies that are based on free speech and the ability for people to say what they like and all this, and the sort of the underlying principle of the internet and the way we communicate, that it is open to all. And I think there are problems around that, and could be particularly acute for nuclear relationships too.
Thank you, Andrew. I will kind of pack a lot into the next question, and you can pick and choose. Because you, to a certain degree, you touched upon that during your presentation and some of the answers, particularly on the non-state actors. Should we also be talking about the increased nuclear weapons use and the risks of that in that form? Because deterrence stability is one side of the coin. And the other one is, should we then speak more about the nuclear risks and the increased nuclear risks because of some of these technologies? And I know this is one of the topics that is being discussed even in the advance of the 10th NPT review conference and in some other fora. So that's one side of it. The second, somewhat kind of linked to it, but question is, how does the impact of some of these new technologies, and I would here suspect the person who asked that also had in mind both some of the negative impact and some of the potential positive impact, like opportunities for verification and everything, could impact the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. So these are maybe too much for one question, but they kind of fall one after another for you to tackle.
Yeah, I think actually I might go for the TPNW question first. I think it's a really, really fascinating one, and I don't have a really good answer, but I've got some thoughts of how it is, and I understand that some of the groups that were behind the ban treaty are already sort of thinking about this and thinking about the implications of the types of systems, technologies, developments that we're talking about today. And I suppose the two questions kind of link, because if we accept, and I think this is probably true, that various different technological pressures and challenges and developments are increasing nuclear risks, which I think they are, or changing, or at least making us think differently, then it does push into the logic of the ban treaty, which says, well, when is enough? When do risks become too much that actually we don't want to live in a world where nuclear weapons have become even more risky, that something might go on, there's even higher chance of use, and that could play into the hands of the ban treaty more broadly. And I think part of what has been quite worrying over the last 5 years or so is this technological challenge, or challenges on one hand, which go back much further and move much slower in some extent, but the kind of the return of the rhetoric around nuclear weapons, which we hadn't seen for a long time. And I think that worries people as well. The return of explicitly using nuclear threats or nuclear weapons as part of statecraft, is a concern. And I think that, going back to what I said about this idea of a third nuclear age, it's a sort of a return of nuclear geopolitics to the light that we haven't really seen since the 1980s. So that return of rhetoric, the loose use of nuclear threats or the linkages with nuclear weapons with threats by various different actors, I think is really worrying. And I think it is possible. I mean, whether this goes directly, I don't know, but a feeling that we're all at greater risk of an accident or nuclear use probably can only play into the hands of those that want to expand the influence of the ban treaty. I mean, how that kind of works in practice, I don't know, but it does create that climate, I think. And I guess the interesting thing about the ban treaty is it's a real challenge to, I think Nick Ritchie described it as the hegemony, or the US hegemony in nuclear order. So the idea that since the 1940s, it's been US led. It's always been kind of underpinned by an idea that deterrence is a key part of nuclear order, and we can't get around it's an indisputable fact and all of this. And what Nick said, and I think there's a lot more to this as well, is that the ban treaty is a way of saying, no, deterrence is not a legitimate part of nuclear. I know others have said it, but this is the first time it's really, I guess, kind of codified or codified in this way. And I think that presents a real challenge. So if we get beyond the idea that deterrence has to be about nuclear weapons, of which the ban treaty might do, then this does open up different conversations about scenario 4, which I mentioned in the slide, about moving to a world where we don't rely on nuclear weapons. And I guess the big question for the people involved in the TPNW, and I guess I know the answer, but I think there's an interesting debate, is moving to a world with less nuclear weapons through the ban treaty isn't necessarily a safer or better or less a world with less conflict, and that is managing that process is incredibly difficult. So I think there are a number of really interesting dynamics around this, around nuclear risk, worrying but interesting, that could well play into the hands of expanding the ban treaty, albeit it's the process of doing that, I think is going to be a complicated one.
Andrew, and on that, I think we almost at the end of our webinar, and I would like all our participants today, listeners on Zoom and YouTube, join me in thanking Dr. Andrew Futter for, I think, fascinating and extremely interesting tour de force through a lot of concepts today, and paving way to our further discussions in the subsequent webinars of this series. Once again, we plan a series of them every Wednesday for the next couple of weeks, and you can check our website for the listing and the topics of it. I also want to thank the Austrian Foreign Ministry that actually gave us an idea to look at some of these issues, and for their support in this regard. And I hope you all enjoyed as much today's discussion as I did. And it's only the beginning of the further discussion on this very important topic. Andrew, thank you so much, and all the best. We'll be following your studies in the Third Nuclear Age project, and hope to see you back again with some new findings from that work.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for hosting me. And just to reiterate, if people want to get in touch, please feel free to send me an email.
Yes, and thank you all, and all the best to you. With that, stay safe and healthy. Bye-bye.